Slides? Awesome, thanks, Charmaine. Okay, great. So let's see if I can go to the next one. There we are. All right, so today I'll be speaking to you about maybe my favorite topic to talk about in the world. So definitely feel free to interrupt if you have any questions, or throw them in the chat and Charmaine can read them out to me if I miss them. We'll also be doing some polls. So we'll talk about K-12 education, although if you in the Q&A or during the conversation want me to think about early education and higher education, be happy to. But the focus is definitely on K-12, which is, of course, the biggest segment of education in the United States. And I am an intersectional scholar, so I will be taking that lens and explaining what intersectionality is. Then we'll move through and think through how public education has been created in an unequal fashion since it was brought into existence. We'll also move through key political and economic questions or debates around who is responsible for providing education. And also then, of course, moving to school choice policies, specifically thinking about charter schools, but we'll touch on a couple other forms of these kinds of policies. And then we'll finish up thinking about the educator workforce, which sometimes falls out of conversations about educational inequality, but I think it's super important to think through, especially from an intersectional lens. And then moving forward to think through potential for collective power and change, sort of trying to drive home this series theme of social justice. So here's the first poll. How familiar are you with the concept of intersectionality? Is it something you've heard of before, but you can't really say, given it some thought, but you know, you're not like devoted to it, or you haven't read a bunch of books about it? Just kind of want to see where we're at. Okay, so everybody's voted. Awesome. So we're sharing the results now. So if you can see these, hopefully, most folks have either never, most folks have really devoted themselves to it. So yay for us. And for folks who haven't, those of you who've never heard of it, you're in the right spot. And if you can't say much about it, you two, y'all are my people. We're gonna bring you through, shepherd you in, so that hopefully you can feel a little bit more confident in having conversations about intersectionality. Thanks, Charmaine. Okay, so what is intersectionality? This is a really important theory within not just sociology, but in the social sciences in general, as well as these interdisciplinary fields like women gender studies, American multicultural studies, African American studies, and so forth. Intersectionality is where we're thinking about systems of power, right, which do entail dimensions of difference in terms of identities and how we self-identify our positionality within these systems of power. These systems of power, like the golden three, right, that we think about in intersectionality are race, gender, and class. Other forms of social difference are also fair game and included, as you can see in this little graphic on the slide, from sexuality, ability, age, to language. I would also add things like citizenship status as being very important in thinking through what different forms of identity really shape your experiences in the world. These are also what shapes systems, right? And so these are power-laden systems. It means that capitalism doesn't happen in a vacuum apart from, let's say, gender, race, racism, sexism, right? They're all happening in one messy constellation. So it's the job of scholars like myself and you, right, as junior in the field of academia, to think through and understand how you could actually tease apart these systems. So how do intersectional scholars decide when they're studying a given social phenomena, how to study it, right? Which should they focus on? Should it be race, class, gender, sexuality, language? Like, how do you decide? What is it? And the answer to that question that has emerged from scholarship is that you focus on whatever's most salient in that specific instance or case of inequality or that specific social phenomena that you're studying. And so I bring together intersectionality with critical race theory. So for me, I would argue that race is always going to be salient, regardless of what you're studying. And so I do tend to study institutions or realms of society where race is obvious to most people what's going on. But I think it's important to recognize that critical race scholars could always explain to you how race matters in a given example or situation, right? And I'd be happy to talk that through more with you. Key here is recognizing this problem that's been in the intellectual tradition in the United States and abroad, where race is reduced to class. This is especially a problem with Marxist sociologists, for example, where we want to just say, well, actually, we can understand and explain that inequality, for example, in uneven life chances and outcomes in the labor market by talking about class relationships, right? It can be reduced to that. Critical race scholars like myself would say, no, friend, you're unfortunately overlooking the fact that race is apart from class, right? We make distinctions about race and experience it as a set of relationships that is separate from class, actually, and can be mapped onto them. Specifically thinking about capitalism as a racial phenomenon, right? Where we're thinking about how goods and services are produced and distributed are fundamentally racialized, right? So folks are being oppressed or advantaged in the labor market based on their race, for example. So how do we actually bring this intersectionality to bear on educational inequalities? And we do that through thinking through these 4 bullet points on this slide. Those are sort of key aspects of how intersectional scholars study inequalities. So we're really focused on how access to opportunities or these specific kinds of educational services are shaped by our positionality and how folks read us, but also how we're situated within the institutional arrangements. What neighborhood do you live in? And therefore, what schools are you assigned to and can access for free? Right? And your access is one set of questions. Another set of questions is once you've accessed that opportunity, what types of experiences or treatment do you face within that institution, right? How do teachers interact with you in the classroom? How do students interact with you, right? All of these different aspects of how you may or may not benefit from being in a classroom. You may or may not receive that mentorship, that extra help, that good word of support. You might instead be called on the carpet, so to speak, and be disciplined in ways that have real lifelong effects. So when we're thinking about education, I would say in the United States, it's fundamental to understand it as a citizenship right. Many folks would argue that K-12 schools are actually the largest aspect of the welfare state in the United States. So thinking about the welfare state here as the set of social supports that tries to get residents and citizens back in the labor market if they fall out. Right? And so when they do fall out, what's one thing that's there for them? Supports to go back to school, let's say, increase their human capital, their credentials, so that they can go back into the labor market and secure a better position. But in order to get people into the labor market to begin with, now that we have these lovely labor laws that prevent kids from working, we need folks to be at least somewhat educated. Right? Citizenship has not always come with education rights. This has been an evolving set of rights since the Civil War, unless you're looking, of course, at New England, where public education started. But one key thing there is to recognize that the link between public schools and class formation in terms of both class consciousness, how much we think about ourselves as being classed or having class beyond this really amorphous middle classness, but how we actually engage in the labor market. And are we workers, right? And are we highly skilled workers? Are we critical thinking workers? Or are we workers who can produce a widget having gone through a set of very mundane tasks? Right? What kind of workers are we? And our K-12 system is based on the Prussian system, which is intended absolutely fundamentally to produce workers rather than these really deeply critical thinking intellectual citizens who could really have a robust engagement with democracy and critiquing democracy or power relations at B. So these class and racial divides are at the very core of public education. And of course, it was a segregated system for the majority of its time and play. But let's focus on class for a second. So one way to think through the US welfare state, again, how citizens and residents are supported, especially in times of dislocation where they might be unemployed, there's devastation, for example, a global pandemic. How are folks treated in the meantime? How do they survive if they can't acquire and obtain and secure a livable wage, right? Those are the key questions. In the United States, the thing that we've been taught, right, and most of us on this call can probably relate to this, that education is the answer, right? Education offers you the doors to opportunity to achieve your dreams, specific to, of course, being upwardly mobile in terms of social class. Right? So you want to use education to gather all of these different skills and experiences, cultural capital, where you feel comfortable talking to people who have wealth, who have different kinds of cultural tastes than you, perhaps, if you're coming from a more working class or poor background, so that you can feel comfortable navigating the opportunity structure and securing yourself an economic foothold. The welfare state in the United States is doing all of this, of course, and giving a relatively heavy investment in public education while not providing a robust and very strong or well-funded social floor. You could also think about this as a social safety net, is another way folks talk about it. But by saying, instead of giving you a floor, we're going to give you the doors, it's saying, look, it's on you, individual, as someone who has the capacity to acquire human capital, to become educated, to develop their social network at college, let's say, and be able to land that excellent job. Because we do know, of course, that opportunities within the labor market often are dependent upon who we know rather than what we know in terms of our skills. Any questions on this? You're welcome to pop in or drop it in the chat. Okay, cool. So when we're thinking more broadly, right, the class formation sort of aspect and understanding of education as part of the welfare state sort of tends to fall out. But what doesn't fall out, what's sort of a traditional way of teaching K-12 history and our orientation toward it in the United States, is to recognize that it's a segregated system in terms of race. Right? And this is the fundamental narrative about it, is there was a massive movement in the mid 20th century, specifically for Black emancipation and liberation. Other racially minoritized groups rose up in the same period of the mid 20th century, particularly afterward, thinking of the Chicano movement, for example, the American Indian movement, Asian American movement, and it worked to organize and secure more robust citizenship rights to K-12 schools, as well as other types of rights, right? Being able to vote, being able to hold public office, etc., not being discriminated against in broader society. And so the key aspects of the movement that were focused on K-12 were around integrating the schools. However, how it ended up actually working out was better talked about, I think, as desegregation, right? There's a difference there between saying integration and desegregation. And part of the reason that segregation is so important to civil rights activists and organizers and scholars who take a critical bend on the problem at hand is because it's through how pupils are assigned to specific schools that other kinds of resources are also distributed to those schools. For example, right, we can think through how our residential assignment of where we live then determines where we go to school, as also being about how much property value does our home have or where we're renting have, and then that generates funds that go to support our neighborhood schools. It also functions in more cultural ways of resources in terms of the kind of reputation that the school receives, right? And being a reflection of the neighborhood's reputation, let's say, as being dangerous, as being very affluent. Also, in the more cultural aspect, it shapes families and the kinds of parents, right? And families that are at that school and who can then reinvest continually or not within the school. For example, if you have parents who are mostly affluent, middle class, maybe one of the parents doesn't work full time by choice, right? And has more time, then that person is more likely to be able to volunteer, right? And bring in other resources to the school that will further support it. So all of those things are why segregation really matters. But it also has really important effects later down the road in terms of our life course, right? It means it's who you're interacting with in terms of your peer groups, who you'll be friends with, who you'll maybe go on to have intimate relationships and marry and have children with, who you will ultimately maybe be coworkers with and hook up with job referrals and all of these kinds of things. Another aspect of educational inequality that really matters from an intersectional lens is the treatment of students within the schools. So once you're in the school, what's going on? And tracking or segregation within schools is one of those things that happens. But another major problem in terms of thinking of intersectionality to move us beyond sort of this more solely racial focus is to think about the availability of services for special student populations. Right? For English second language students, are those resources available? Are you stuck in the class in the back of a regular classroom where your ESL teacher is whispering, whereas the other teacher is shouting, right? These are the kinds of things that are really important and sort of become more invisibilized in these arguments. A similar case could be made for special education services. So again, thinking back to that key tension and narrative of how we understand racism in K-12 society is through segregation and these Supreme Court cases that have focused on interrupting or allowing segregation to continue in the country's schools. Not all of these cases, specifically looking at Plessy and Ferguson, here the first case listed in the timeline, are about education, right? Plessy and Ferguson was actually about streetcar use in New Orleans, and so it was more broadly about public services. These issues are fundamentally asking, is it a constitutional right of citizens to receive public services? Do these public services need to be one stream, integrated, desegregated in order for those to be considered constitutional? In 1954, most of you, I think, would recognize that, right, Brown v. Board of Education is one of the most well-known Supreme Court cases we've ever had. This is where separate but equal was decided to be unconstitutional. It was a violation of the protection of equal rights. In other words, it means that in order for the school system to be aligned with the constitution of the land, we could no longer allow for the explicit and intentional practice of separating students by race. You'll notice that here afterwards, Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg, coming out of North Carolina, this case happened almost 20 years later, and it was simply to say, no, you actually need to do this thing that we told you to do 20 years ago. So the key tension that I want you to focus on for thinking about segregation and the continual problem of it is this tension between local government and local control over schools and state governments, and especially federal government. Whereas when the federal government says, hey, states, stop doing this really obvious racist thing, local governments have often resisted in large part because of white local resistance and also the infiltration of white racists within the local government, specifically thinking of school districts. So let's have another poll real quick. This is just a true false, right? Not a gotcha, just a true false to say, so are US public schools more segregated now around 2020, 2021 than they were 20 years ago in the early 1990s? Just a couple more people. All right, so it looks like most folks have come in and said true, which is correct, right? They're absolutely more segregated today than they were 20 years ago. And that is in large part because of that last court case listed on that timeline, as you all must know, since you got this correct, that basically put a halt to having federal court mandates to bus students in order to desegregate. It said, no, no, you all have done enough. Since then, resegregation has been occurring, and some would argue it's increasing based on available data. So what are these key factors of inter-school segregation, so that between school segregation? Public policy is the key thing that I want to highlight for you here, right? Clearly, right, based on the Supreme Court cases that have put a halt to requiring local districts to bus students in order to have more proportional representation of students that reflects the broader area. The school board is the group that has a ton of power. Locally, right? That's the major funder of most K-12 schools, with states being the second biggest source of funding for K-12. And it's these school boards that decide how resources and pupils are assigned to schools. For example, in Boston, Massachusetts, the school board had been using different, very intentional practices to maintain segregated schools for decades, through until the 1970s, when they had busing riots, when they were finally forced to integrate. So here we have this, this really important example of seeing how a school board is not actually saying, let's have neighborhood schools. They're saying, let's have white schools and Black schools, right? And so a Black student can pass multiple schools on her way to her assigned school, which was based on her race, not her address. Right. And so we have this false narrative that it's all about neighborhoods, and it's only through housing segregation that we have school segregation. That's not actually the case. It's a both and situation where policies are really specific. It's sort of an educational gerrymandering, if you will, in order to have the kind of representation that you want in the schools. I'm going to skip over the redlining and discrimination stuff of housing policy. Happy to talk about that later if there's interest. And just again mention that this whole time that there was inequality in the school system, right, starting in the 18th century, even around access to public education, there have been resistance movements and organized pushes in the community to access fuller citizenship rights. That's very, very important to recognize. In part because one of the reasons there hasn't been just this amazing, just obvious, beautiful, streamlined process of uninterrupted progress is because there's also organized white backlash, in part through state-sanctioned actions that have resisted said progress at various points. So let's take a step back for a second and think about public education from a more political and economic lens. Who is responsible for providing it, right? Is it the family at home or the government? Or is it some combination of both? And this has been the conversation since before public education was started in the 1830s, 1840s in Massachusetts. If we think about it as being provided from the family, then we really need to recognize what that means in terms of both race, class, and gender, or excuse me, all three of those. Thinking specifically of gender here, where who's going to stay home from the labor market in order to provide education services or do this homeschooling, be a homeschooling parent teacher, right? Probably the woman. That's what the studies show. This is definitely where we see some gendered inequality in terms of unpaid labor in the home. But it also reflects these broader issues in terms of how the job market works and the ways that folks are sorted through it, and it's stratified such that even if you wanted to have that more traditional gendered sort of division of tasks at home where the woman stays home, if you're in a Black marriage, two Black people married with kids, and you're being discriminated against in the labor market, it's going to be harder for that Black man to provide an adequate income in order to have that opportunity. for their kids. So that's just one example of how all three, race, gender, class, are really salient here. It's not just homeschooling that the family provides, it's also tutoring services, test prep, you name it, right? These other aspects of the education industry that they can provide. The government, however, is offering this public option that's free, right? And it's also controlled for by elected or appointed officials. More and more, we're seeing a struggle over who should provide education, both who should pay for it, but also who's responsible for it. And so more and more, we're seeing the private sector entering into this, this arrangement where we're creating and distributing opportunities for education. So we'll see the government more and more going directly to the private market, right, and paying for services rather than producing it itself. This is a process, of course, called privatization or marketization, depending on sort of which theoretical stance you're taking, is which word you'd use maybe. And again, I have this line between family and government really bold and thick and solid because 90% of kids in the US, about 90% go to public K-12 schools. There's only 10% really that are peeled off and go to private schools. And then it's hard to measure, but about 2% with homeschool. And this is all, of course, pre-COVID data, since that's sort of just jumped off the charts there. And this struggle over the control of education, who's responsible, who's paying, is really about whether or not it should be a for-profit endeavor, right? And if we should have more and more competition and choice, and if that competition and choice can remove responsibility for providing it over curriculum and who's staffing it, and moving that to both firms that are nonprofit and for-profit. And government does go to for-profit firms, so there could be another line there. But here what you're seeing is this line between family and government is getting broken up. It's no longer quite as solid, in part because of how much the government is contracting out to different kinds of firms. So let's think through, what does this mean for us, right? And what kinds of schools you went to. So here's another poll. What kinds of schools did you attend? And hopefully you can select all that apply. If you can't select all that apply, pick the one that you went to for most years. So the modal number of years, like where did you go to school for most of your K-12 experience? Did you go to a charter school, a district school? And if you went to a magnet school, you just mark that as district. Did you go to a Catholic school? That'd be a religious private, of course. Were you homeschooled at any point? All right, looks like we had a couple folks that went to charter school, at least for a time. Awesome. Only one person who went to a private school, which is way less than I was expecting. I was expecting to have at least one person in the group having gone to a religious private school, specifically thinking about Catholic schools, which are really popular here in California. All right, cool. So we have a decent variety of representation here. So in thinking about these different options, it's because there are these multiple pathways to get through K-12, right? Like you can move in and out of different kinds of schools. I know of homeschooling specifically before COVID, right? Folks would often enter homeschool for just a year or two, or for K-6 and then enter into public school, for example. So in thinking about these different choices, where it's being reflected on us that school choice exists and matters, right? These are a set of public policies that create these other options for families so that they could have a choice to go to a school that is not the one they're assigned to based on their residential location. These policies inject and create a ton of competition between schools for resources of various kinds, from money, students and their parents, right, who come with different kinds of means, as we discussed, as well as facilities and locations, buildings, and different things like that we can talk about later specific to charters. The idea here is that school choice should exist so that instead of requiring families to be really mobile in terms of the housing market, so they could pick up and move and get into a better school district or zone so their kid can go to a better performing schools, that they can stay where they live and still send their kid to a better school. So the notion is you want to escape a badly performing school. However, it's really important to recognize that actually school choice was born out of segregation and segregationists wanting to maintain white schools as being separate from Black schools. Segregation academies is one really key aspect of this story. These were born out of following the 1954 Brown versus Board decision in Prince Edward County, Maryland, where all of the public schools were closed following the decision. And instead, whites opened private schools using a combination of public monies and private donations. And so this is an example of vouchers, right? Where the public gives a specific, like a check, essentially, a specific amount of money to a family and says you can spend it on private schooling for your kid. Here on the right side of the screen, you'll notice this is another set of protests, right? The reason Brown versus Board happened was through protests that went through the courts. Protests are constant through this, right? We have to recognize that there's always this push for something better, for more equality. And so I'm curious here, maybe we'll get this right as well. We did the true false, but what's the most widespread form of publicly funded school choice in the country? So by publicly funded there, I mean that it's actually public monies that are paying for this other schooling. So if your parents, right, just paid for you to go to a Catholic school, or your parish paid for you to go to the Catholic school, that's not a form of public funded school choice because the government didn't pay for it at all. Right, so it really, really is about our taxpayer funds being used to supply this particular service. A couple more folks. Awesome. Okay. So yes, we can call this good with almost everyone voting. Education savings accounts are really new, and so those are not quite as well used. Magnets are definitely the least used of the group. They've fallen out of favor. Charters are the most widespread form, and vouchers failed to gain popularity. And the reason that this is the case with vouchers is because, right, most people actually love their public schools and are really happy about how they perform. And so there's no need to change them from their vantage point. But thinking about charter schools as this most widespread form, let's focus on them for a bit. So charter schools are a hybrid set of institutions. They're publicly funded but privately operated. They're considered not necessarily by all to be a panacea or this beautiful solution to the problem of inequality in the public system, but they're definitely seen to be a cornerstone of a triage set of public policies that will help fix the achievement gaps that we continue to see in our public schools. They received bipartisan support from Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and of course, our new administration will likely follow in the Obama administration's footsteps. These are racially contentious schools. They have a racial justice origin point that we can talk about if you want. But what makes them especially racially contentious at this point is that they are framed as being a civil rights issue, a key civil rights issue of our time, and yet they're resegregating the schools, and there's no evidence that they perform better than their district counterparts. The conflicts over charter schools are specific to their expansion at this point. And we'll talk about why that is on the next slide, but essentially there's this question of, well, why are the schools so unequal in terms of the kinds of performances that they produce on standardized tests, graduation rates? Who's to blame here? Who's the cause, right? Is it bad teachers, poorly run, poorly managed school districts and bureaucracies, parents who don't care about education, students who are stupid, students who don't care about education? Is it poverty that's actually the problem? Is it public policy? What's really to cause the key issue here? Because if we can identify the cause, right, then we can better understand and identify solutions. That's the idea. And so in the debate over charter expansion, it's saying, look, school districts are part of the problem, as are teachers and unions and policies that have been governing these school districts, because these are the institutions that have created time and time again disparate results in terms of how folks perform on tests, dropout factors in terms of which high schools actually produce high school diplomas. Other key debates that are connected to this expansion, of course, are around money and the funding structure of charter school policies. All charter school policies that I know of, and they vary widely from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction, is that money follows the child. And so if a child opts to leave a district school and go to the charter school, the money that was earmarked for her, that per pupil spending allotment amount, will leave the district and go to her. So essentially it means that districts are losing funds and students that bring other kinds of resources at a time where we're already in a diminished resource environment. And I'll skip these other 2 points, but happy to talk about them. Education, as I mentioned at the beginning, is also really important to recognize as an actual part of the economy more broadly. It is the second largest sector of the economy, behind only healthcare. Almost 4 million workers work in this sector, about 1 million of whom work in the K-12 schools. So it's important to recognize sort of what's going on and how are those workers being treated. And you'll hear teachers talk about the fact that their work conditions are, of course, their students' learning conditions. So how many teachers of color did you have in your K-12 school? Think back, dig deep, right? How many? Who either identified as of color or who you read as of color, because sometimes there's a difference there. And these could be any kind of teacher that you had in K-12, not assistants in the classroom, but actual teachers, right? It could have been your gym teacher or your art teacher, your English teacher, but it was the head teacher in that classroom from K-12. So when I was making this, I had to count on my hands. I was trying to figure out how easy is this to answer? I ended up at around 5. And I'm from North Carolina, where the teaching population is a bit more diverse than in, say, New England, where I got my graduate degree. All right, just a couple more folks to come in, give you a couple seconds. All right, thank you so much for all your voting. So 20% of us have never had a teacher of color. Let's just hold that in the space for a second. None. Zip, zero, none. And another 33% of us, 1 or 2. Okay, so well over half of us, about 2/3, had 5 or less teachers of color, whereas 1 person had more than 15. Would love to hear more about that. That's awesome. Okay, thank you, Charmaine. Great. And so there I wanted to point out how white the school workforce is specific to K-12. 80% nationally of our K-12 educator workforce identifies as non-Hispanic white. 80%. And the student body, meanwhile, is around 49.5% white, right? So you can see the disparity there and the problem. I want to point out that the Brown decision is actually part of the reason that this workforce is so white. There was a massive displacement of Black teachers and principals with white teachers and principals following the Brown decision. So it's not just that the Brown decision affected the school makeup in terms of student composition, it also affected teacher compositions. So what? Why does it matter that K-12 teachers are mostly white women? I've listed some of the impacts here for you. Most important from most people's vantage points is the discriminatory treatment that happens within classrooms, absolutely, which can end up leading to disparate discipline, as well as unequal opportunities to actually learn and apply your skills and have opportunities to practice those skills outside of the classroom through an internship, for example. I would also point to the racial divisions of teachers' unions as being important because they continue to shape how teachers push for certain kinds of policies or curriculum changes, let's say, and wraparound services in the schools. So it diminishes the ability of teachers of representing sort of those diverse viewpoints of their communities. And also this means that there's a disproportionate concentration of these really great middle-class jobs compared to the bad jobs of, say, like the retail sector within white households and communities. So there's a further concentration of income, wealth, and status due to this problem. We have seen a rise in teacher activism. This is certainly true in terms of teachers' unions, but it's also true in terms of wildcat strikes where individual teachers are deciding to strike and withdraw their labor in order to have changes made to improve the services that their students receive, including boosting funding for the classrooms, also pushing for different regulatory structures for charter schools, for example. Many of us see the teachers' unions as the most important sort of safeguard or defending factor of the public K-12 schools, and that's why we want to pay attention to what the unions are doing. The final thing I'll say about this is that the unions, and we can look to Chicago teachers as well as the LA teachers for this, to creating interracial coalitions with community groups on the ground in their area. Right. So rather than saying we're all about protecting white women's middle class jobs and our seniority and tenure and job security, we're about having actual inroads made because we recognize that K-12 public school systems have a racist history and a current racist setup that needs to be changed and requires intervention and serious sustained intervention, not just lip service saying that race matters or diversity matters, but actually redistributing resources in a meaningful way. So here, let's have our last little interactive moment. I'm not sure if you've heard of a chatterfall. It's kind of a cute little fun word. A chatterfall is like growing out of this Zoom world we're in, right? Where you'll type into the chat and then we'll all press enter at once. So it's sort of like this cascade effect that happens in the chat, which can be really beautiful. And like, again, beautiful in the Zoom world way. Bear with us. So what's the most important thing you'll take away from this presentation? Right, and so take a few seconds, don't press enter yet. What are a few things you'll take away from this presentation? Okay, and I'll do a countdown in a couple seconds, a 5-second countdown, give you time to type for a second. All right, so in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Oh, it's beautiful, yay. Okay, so you can scroll and then see. Yeah, that's a major problem. Awesome. Yay. Yes, yes, I love it. Thank you so much. Okay, and then just really quick, here are the references, and I'm glad you have the slides so you could check them out. And thank you so much. And I'd be happy to entertain any questions. Thanks, Anna.
I have a question for you.
Go ahead.
So I was wondering, how do you feel about, at least I used to work in an urban school in South Dallas, and one of the problems that I saw was that a lot of the teachers came from surrounding suburbs. They weren't directly from the community. Could you talk a little bit about that and its impact on a student's educational experience?
Absolutely, great point. And this is a major problem nationally, right? And we see this as even more of a problem in charter schools, actually, because of their really deeply institutionalized relationship with Teach for America, which the whole program's sort of mode of operation is to bring students in who are not from there, right? Like who are literally from a different part of the country, not just from the suburbs of Dallas, right? But in thinking about how either you're not from the city that you're teaching in, or you have decided not to live there, but to live in the outskirts of that community, which is the case in places like Boston, where I did a lot of research, what you end up seeing is that students aren't connecting to teachers in the same way. And teachers aren't connecting with their students or their families. They're not having relationships outside of the classroom or outside of parent-teacher night, right? You're not going to see them in the grocery store. You're not going to see them at the block party. Like, you're not there if you don't live there. And so what that ends up meaning is that there's a disconnect. And so the tension that can exist in lower performing, quote, urban schools that serve more students who are in poverty and facing various other resource constraints it means that they have teachers that are more likely to look at them through a deprivation lens, right? And so instead of seeing them as that bring a lot of assets, resilience, there's plenty of resources in communities that are impoverished, right? It's coming at them in a way that is definitely looking at them as deficient, and especially culturally so. And so I think that one of the key things, Sean, is that you see a ton of individual level racism and microaggressions through both implicit and explicit bias, where folks are both intentionally and unconsciously being racist in the classroom. And so you have a ton of effects in terms of discipline of Latinx and Black students specifically.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Great question. Do voucher systems have more potential as far as diversity and quality in education? This is a good question. Okay, so I think that it depends, right, on how you want to think about who's responsible and then who would control and oversee these other kinds of institutions. Right, we're currently in this this moment of hyper accountability in K-12 education, high stakes testing, and so forth. That is not the case for private schools or these independent schools that would receive these vouchers. And so I think that the jury's out on how well do they perform. We don't know. We don't have those data. They don't take the state exams that are required of charter schools and district schools. So I think it's really hard to answer that question using data that we have in terms of performance. I think in terms of your questions around diversity, folks would point to the fact that some private schools are where we see more whites staying in city schools specifically. So in that sense, you might not have as much white flight to escape from students of color, essentially. Sorry, okay. More about the role of disparities in parent engagement and determining student success. So I can really speak to this from the lens of charters. I think that there's a danger of speaking about this really broadly without specific cases because of the cultural racist sort of underlying tenets of this conversation around who cares enough to volunteer at their student's school. And that care is representative of their time and other resources that they could dedicate. But that fails to recognize how constrained poor and working class families are in being able to feel comfortable, but also have the time, transportation, other childcare, all these other things that would be required in order to volunteer in the schools. Some charter schools, so with that in mind, some charter schools do require parents to be able to volunteer a certain number of hours in order to have their students enroll at that charter. Right. And so what that means is you're going to get a very particular kind of slice of the population who's eligible even to go to that charter school based on what kind of jobs or not their parents work, if they have, other care responsibilities and so forth. Yeah, so CRT, this is an important question. So I think that some folks would push back, like the true CRT folks would say that because I don't do counter storytelling, which is one of the 5 key tenets of critical race theory, that I shouldn't have claim to this theory. But with that in mind, and I do think that the counter storytelling piece really matters, where you're actually saying, let's have folks who have been marginalized and otherwise ignored in terms of mainstream academia and policy making, let's center their voices and their perspectives. I definitely think that's important. I would say that my work really pushes back against seeing public and private as this good, bad binary, and instead wants to recognize how public has both done racism onto communities, but has also attempted to redress said racism, right? And showing how it's complicated through market forces, and that recognizing the for-profit intention specific to the real estate sector and the facilities sector within the sort of charter story really matters, right? Policy elites and industry elites, right? The ruling class is important to recognize here. And I bring the lens of saying, and that class is mostly white, and does not care to rectify the key sort of mechanisms that allow for inequalities to be reproduced across levels of society. So whether it's in the classroom, right, in that micro level, or more broadly in terms of how students and teachers and other resources are distributed across schools. Okay, so Teach for America is also problematic due to the time constraints. Yes, absolutely. And so this is a really short-term gig. Correct me if I'm wrong here, other people on the call, but I think that you're only working there for like 2 or 3 years, and you have something like really intensive and what I would consider to be ridiculously insane, like a 5-week training period or something, where it's just like all out training, and then you're thrown into a classroom where, keep in mind that to get a teaching credential, right, you've had to do years of classroom work, right, as well as student teaching, where you're giving and getting feedback for years so you can develop. Do those teachers come out perfect? No. As a teacher, I can tell you, you're never done becoming a better teacher, right? You're always developing. And so one of the key problems is that you're putting teachers who have the least amount of experience, who are not from this place, who do not have ties to this community or cultural knowledge and institutional memory, et cetera, historical knowledge of that place, into the most deprived schools in terms of that sort of need the best teachers, are getting the least experience and the least equipped. So it's a major, major problem. Will it remain localized or move towards a more central hub? Oh, okay. Yes, I definitely think that for the most part, I think that in terms of K to 12, we are going to see maintenance of localized education, except for the growth of charters that are virtual. I think that's a major, major growth sector. Cyber schools, which have been growing well before the pandemic, are now exploding. And one key thing I would want to point your eye toward is thinking about how homeschool and charter schools actually are overlapping in the space of 100% virtual schools, where parents can still be teachers as well, but they don't have to develop any curriculum or buy curriculum. Instead, they've enrolled the student. The student is therefore covered in terms of it's free tuition, right? Taxpayers pay for this instead, and they can maintain some responsibility for their student there. And I do think that the technology divide, we're seeing massive amounts of disparities. But I will also say, thinking about the problem of white teachers and discrimination in the classroom, is that we are seeing some emerging evidence. And again, this is all like tough to have empirical bases for because it's so recent, and research moves at such a glacial pace. But we are seeing that some Black students, and I would bet that for certain Latinx populations as well, that some students are doing better right now than they were when they were going to school. And that's in part because they're not facing racism every day in their classrooms, right? And they're not getting disciplined by classroom teachers. And they're not getting wrongly diagnosed and putting into special education classrooms when they don't actually belong there, right? And so I do want to be really optimistic about, like, yeah, we're going to open back up when it's safe to do so. It's not going to, people aren't going to die, et cetera. But let's think what's actually good about maybe having this moment where we can see who benefits from this, because bad things aren't happening every day. That makes sense.
Are there any other questions? We could take one more if not.
I have one more question.
Sure, thanks.
So can you comment about enclaves and zoning for districts when you have like competing districts, like especially within Dallas, you have this area called Highland Park, and it exists within like 2 highways, and it's zoned for very affluent populations, and then Dallas Independent School District surrounds it. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, Preeti, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, Preeti, I didn't mean to miss your question. Okay, sorry. Do you know if there are still school districts that do busing to desegregate? What would it take for federal, even states to reenact? To my knowledge, there aren't any that do busing that's mandated from the state or federal level. What would it take? It would require the federal government to acknowledge that there is continued segregation that's happening, and that there's an effect from it. right? So that inequality is continuing due to that it is unequal, because essentially they're saying that separate no longer matters. Sorry. Okay, so I'm going to leave that there. Sean, did you want to jump in? I just want to be aware of time.
Oh yeah. So it was just about like how enclaves like within a city kind of are detrimental to like the holistic like school district system. I just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this gets at the crux of the tension I was talking about, right, between local control. And when we allow for states to determine their local control, you'll see that in especially southern states, but also others, and it works out differently in New England and the West, but that power is able to be concentrated. And then because you're a different polity or a different political body, you have the ability to determine what you get to do and who you get to say no to, right? And this leads to what many folks in like the Highland Park, I think you said, like on their school board, I'm sure they would point to inter-district choice as being a way that they've compromised and are part of a broader solution in the Dallas Metroplex, right? But what they're actually saying is, okay, so we're gonna let in like maybe 25, 30, either way, it'll be like 1 or 2% of students from outer lying areas that are in underperforming schools or districts and let them in. That's enough. And that could be considered a form of busing, right? You're taking someone out of where they live and where they are supposed to go and bringing them elsewhere. But what that really means is that white district and that white political body can say that they are valuing diversity and helping the needy of Dallas unified. But when in fact is they are reproducing the inequality and maintaining segregation, point blank period, right? And it's not to say that that's not happening in Dallas USD. I know Dallas USD a little bit. My brother's kids go there. And there are other ways that things and inequalities are happening there. But this is essentially a way of rich neighborhoods and communities to maintain all of their own funding and decision-making and not to have their kids mingle with kids from the wrong neighborhoods.
Thank you.
Yes.
Well, unfortunately, time is up. Thank you, Dr. Walters, for your very informative talk today and for the audience engagement. I think this is the most we've ever had, which is awesome. Really wish we had more time to continue this conversation. This is so interesting. And I think we've all learned so much about the landscape of education, and a lot of us have not been exposed to education as a structural race and geographical issue. So again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We have another session at 1:15 regarding our service grant and how to apply. So we'll see you in a few minutes if you want to take a break. And you will be getting an email from us on key takeaways from this amazing talk as well, and a feedback form, which is also in the chat, which just lets us know how we can better improve these for the future. And again, thanks for coming and good luck on midterms.
Thanks all. Take good care.
Bye.